Warning: this audiobook was not created to comfort you. If you're looking for motivation, reassurance, or easy answers, you may want to stop listening now, because over the next few hours, you'll confront 30 brutal truths about human nature. Truths that challenge the way you think, the way you react, the way you see other people, and the way you see yourself. Some of these truths will make you uncomfortable. Some may challenge beliefs you've held for years, and a few may change the way you live forever. Stoicism was never meant to make you feel comfortable. It was meant to strip away illusion, to teach you what you can control, what you never could, and why most human suffering begins when we confuse the two. If you're willing to exchange comforting lies for uncomfortable truth, stay with me. Because the first of these 30 brutal truths about human nature begins now. But before we do, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who has supported this channel over the years. I'm also excited to share that the Audiobook Vision Store is now officially open. Many of the audiobooks featured on this channel are now available as professionally formatted PDF editions for anyone who would like to read them, build a personal library, or simply support the future of this channel. The audiobooks will always remain free here on YouTube. But if you'd like to own a copy of this book and help us continue creating more long-form audiobooks like this one, you'll find the store link in the description below. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. Introduction: why Stoicism isn't meant to comfort you. Sit down for a moment, not because I want to teach you a philosophy, but because I want to challenge a story you've probably believed for most of your life. You've been told that happiness comes from gaining more, controlling more, becoming more success, more approval, more certainty, more comfort. Yet, despite having more than any generation before us, people have never seemed more anxious, more distracted, or more emotionally exhausted. Perhaps the problem isn't the world. Perhaps it's the way we see it. This is where Stoicism enters the conversation, not as a collection of inspirational quotes, and certainly not as another self-improvement trend, but as one of history's most uncompromising investigations into the human mind. Over the years, Stoicism has been transformed into something its founders would barely recognize. Today, it's often reduced to motivational slogans, morning routines, productivity tips, or social media quotes placed beside the image of Marcus Aurelius. But that isn't the Stoicism you'll encounter in this book. The philosophers who built this tradition, men like Zeno, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, weren't trying to make life easier. They were trying to make human beings harder to deceive. They understood something that modern psychology continues to confirm. The greatest battles in life are rarely fought against the outside world. They are fought inside the mind, against fear, against anger, against desire, against ego, against the stories we tell ourselves every single day. That is why this book is called The Dark Psychology of Stoicism. Not because Stoicism is dark, but because it forces us to examine the darker parts of ourselves that we usually avoid, the hidden fears that shape our decisions, the unconscious desires that quietly control our behavior, the emotional habits that leave us vulnerable to disappointment, manipulation, and unnecessary suffering. Over the next 30 chapters, we'll explore 30 brutal truths about human nature. Some will challenge the way you think, others will challenge the way you see the people around you, and a few may challenge the person you believe yourself to be. These truths aren't designed to entertain you. They're designed to remove illusion. You'll discover why comfort often weakens us, why anger usually reveals vulnerability instead of strength, why chasing approval quietly steals your freedom, why suffering grows when we fight reality instead of understanding it, and why the greatest form of power has almost nothing to do with controlling other people. This isn't a book about suppressing emotions. The Stoics never asked people to become cold, emotionless, or indifferent. They asked something far more difficult: to understand emotions before obeying them, to question thoughts before believing them, to separate reality from interpretation, because most suffering doesn't begin with events. It begins with the meaning we attach to those events. Long before neuroscience and cognitive psychology, the Stoics recognized a profound truth. The mind is both our greatest ally and our greatest deceiver. Everything in this book builds upon that idea. Each chapter focuses on one uncomfortable truth about human nature, combining Stoic philosophy with timeless psychological insight. Not to give you easy answers, but to help you ask better questions, questions that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. As we move through these pages, we'll begin with the relationship you have with yourself. Then we'll examine other people, suffering, power, meaning, and finally the one subject that gives every human life its urgency: death. Because the Stoics believed that the person who has learned to face mortality without illusion becomes extraordinarily difficult to frighten, manipulate, or control. This journey won't ask you to become someone else. It will ask you to see yourself more honestly than ever before. And honesty, more often than comfort, is where real freedom begins. So take a deep breath, leave your assumptions behind, and let's begin with the first brutal truth about human nature. Part 1. The truths about the self. Law 1. You are not in control of almost anything. Let's start with the thing that undoes people the fastest: the illusion of control. You wake up believing, on some half-conscious level, that if you just plan well enough, work hard enough, and behave well enough, life will cooperate. Then your flight gets cancelled, or the promotion goes to someone else, or a diagnosis arrives out of nowhere, and that belief cracks. Not because the world got unfair, because it was never fair to begin with, and you'd simply never been forced to notice. Epictetus opens his entire philosophy with this distinction, and it's worth sitting with slowly. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Up to us, our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our own actions. Not up to us, our bodies, our property, our reputation, our position, and, this is the one people resist, the outcomes of almost everything we do. You can run the race, but you cannot control whether you win it. You can love someone completely, but you cannot control whether they stay. You can do excellent work, but you cannot control whether your boss notices, whether the market shifts, whether the company survives. Here's the psychological trap. Most human anxiety is generated by treating not up to us items as if they were up to us. We rehearse conversations that may never happen. We grip outcomes we have no authority over. We build our sense of self-worth on things: other people's opinions, market conditions, our own health, that were never ours to guarantee in the first place. Modern psychology has independently arrived at something close to this. The concept of locus of control, developed by psychologist Julian Rotter in the 1950s, distinguishes between people who believe outcomes are determined mainly by their own actions, internal locus, versus mainly by external forces, external locus. Decades of research since has shown that a healthy, realistic internal locus of control, believing you control your effort, your choices, your responses, correlates with better mental health outcomes than either extreme. But notice, it's not believing you control everything. It's believing you control your responses. That is precisely the Stoic dichotomy, arrived at independently, roughly 2,000 years later. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East, commanding legions during a plague and a series of brutal frontier wars, wrote to himself in the Meditations, not for an audience, not for publication, just as private notes to keep himself sane, that external things are not the problem. It is your judgment about them that is the problem, and this you have the power to eliminate at any moment. Read that again. A man with more raw power than almost anyone alive at the time was reminding himself, privately, that he did not control the plague, did not control the barbarian invasions, did not control his own body's eventual failure. What he controlled was the quality of his own mind in response to those things. This is not resignation. This is not give up and accept whatever happens. That's a lazy misreading. The Stoic position is precise. Act with full effort on the things within your control, and hold the outcomes lightly, because gripping outcomes you don't control produces suffering without producing results. You can prepare for the job interview thoroughly. You cannot control whether they hire you. Do the first part completely. Let go of the second part completely. Most people do the reverse. They underprepare and then obsess over the outcome. Why this is a brutal truth and not a comforting one. It means your sense of safety cannot be outsourced. You cannot make your peace of mind dependent on your partner never leaving, your job never disappearing, your health never failing, your children never suffering. All of those things can happen, regardless of how well you live. If your stability depends on none of them ever happening, you do not have stability. You have a countdown clock. This also means giving up a specific kind of self-flattery. The idea that when good things happen to you, it's because you deserved them. And when bad things happen, someone or something did you wrong. Sometimes you did everything right and it still fell apart. Sometimes you did nothing to deserve the good fortune that landed on you. The universe does not run on a ledger of moral deserts. Seneca, in his letters to his friend Lucilius, repeatedly returns to the idea of fortune as something fundamentally indifferent to human merit. It gives and takes without regard to whether you've earned either. What to actually do with this? First, practice sorting. When something upsets you, ask directly, is this within my control or not? If it's not, the traffic, the weather, someone else's opinion of you, the outcome of an election, a diagnosis, your only legitimate work is deciding how to respond, not how to change it. If it is within your control, your effort, your honesty, your discipline, your attention, then the anxiety is misplaced energy that should be redirected into action. Second, notice how much of your daily stress is spent trying to control other people's judgments of you. Their opinions are not up to you. You can be honest, capable, and kind, and someone will still dislike you, misread you, or spread a rumor about you. That is data about them, not a referendum on your worth. And trying to control it is like trying to control the weather with your mood. Third, build what the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, not as pessimism, but as inoculation. Before a risky venture, briefly imagine the worst realistic outcome. Not to dread it, but to notice that you would, in fact, survive it, and to plan your response in advance, rather than being ambushed by panic when it happens. This is not superstition. It resembles a documented technique used in cognitive behavioral therapy, sometimes called decatastrophizing. Deliberately walking through the feared outcome to discover it is survivable. Here is the uncomfortable payoff of this law. Once you actually accept that you don't control outcomes, you become far harder to destabilize. Not because nothing bad will happen to you, plenty will, but because your peace of mind was never wired to the outcome in the first place. It was wired to your own conduct, which remains entirely yours no matter what the world does. That's the foundation everything else in this book stands on. Once you've metabolized it, we can move to the next truth, which follows directly from it. Your emotions, the ones that feel so undeniably real and justified, are not facts about the world. They are opinions, and most of them are opinions you never consciously chose. Law 2. Your emotions are opinions, not facts. Here's a sentence that will annoy you the first time you read it, and then quietly change how you argue with your own mind for the rest of your life. It is not events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. That line comes from Epictetus, and it is the single most load-bearing idea in Stoic psychology. It sounds almost too simple. Surely being cut off in traffic just is annoying. Surely losing a job just is devastating. Surely being insulted just is humiliating. But look closer, and you'll notice the same event lands completely differently, depending on the person and the moment. The same traffic jam that ruins one person's morning is background noise to someone else who happens to be listening to a good podcast. The same insult that wrecks one person's week is water off the back of someone, secure enough not to need the insulter's approval. The event didn't change. The judgment attached to it did. This isn't just ancient philosophy. It's the direct ancestor of an entire branch of modern psychotherapy. Albert Ellis, developing rational emotive behavior therapy in the 1950s, and Aaron Beck, developing cognitive behavioral therapy shortly after, both explicitly credited the Stoics, and Epictetus in particular, as forerunners of their model. CBT's foundational claim that it is not the situation itself, but our beliefs about the situation that generate emotional distress, and that changing the belief changes the distress, is, almost word for word, the Stoic position from 2,000 years earlier. Ellis kept a quote from Epictetus posted in his office for decades. What does it actually mean to say an emotion is an opinion? It means every strong emotional reaction contains a hidden judgment, usually one of two kinds. This should not be happening, or this means something terrible about me, my future, my worth. Strip the judgment away and look at the bare event, and much of the emotional charge evaporates. Your friend didn't call you back. The bare event. No phone call. The judgment doing the damage. This means she doesn't value me, or this means I did something wrong, or this means I'm unlikable. None of those judgments are facts. They're interpretations, generated at high speed, almost invisibly, and then experienced as though they were simply what happened. This is uncomfortable because it removes your favorite alibi. It is much more satisfying to say, "You made me furious," than "I chose to interpret what you did in a way that produced fury in me." The first sentence puts all the causal power in someone else's hands and leaves you as a passive victim of your own nervous system. The second sentence is accurate, and accuracy is rarely as flattering as blame. None of this means emotions are illegitimate or that you should suppress them. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on anger, not to argue that anger doesn't happen, but to dissect exactly how it forms. Starting with an initial, almost reflexive jolt, which he considered involuntary and not blameworthy, followed by a voluntary assent to the idea that vengeance or retaliation is now appropriate, which he considered entirely within our control and the actual site of moral responsibility. The first movement is biology. The second movement is a choice you are making, usually so fast you don't notice you're making it. This two-stage model matches what contemporary affective neuroscience has found. The amygdala can trigger a fast, largely automatic threat response before the prefrontal cortex. The part of the brain responsible for evaluation, planning, and impulse control has had time to fully weigh in. But that prefrontal evaluation does catch up, typically within a second or two, and it is at that point that the opinion gets attached, reinforced, or challenged. The gap between the initial jolt and the story you build around it is exactly where Stoic practice operates. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone criticizes your work in a meeting. Stage 1, a hot flush, a spike of defensiveness. Automatic, not a moral failing, not something to feel guilty about. Stage 2, the story. They think I'm incompetent. Everyone in the room agrees with them. This is going to affect my career. None of that second stage is guaranteed to be true. It is a narrative you are constructing on top of a raw physical sensation, and you have more control over that narrative than it feels like in the moment. The Stoic move is not to pretend the flush didn't happen. It's to catch the narrative before it hardens and interrogate it. Is it actually true that this one comment means I'm incompetent? Is it actually true that the whole room agrees? What is the evidence versus what is the fear talking? This single habit, pausing between the jolt and the story, is arguably the most practically useful thing in this entire book. And it costs nothing except the willingness to be honest with yourself in the moment you least want to be. There's a harder version of this truth worth sitting with. If your emotions are opinions rather than facts, that means people around you can manipulate your emotional state by shaping your beliefs. Through flattery, through gaslighting, through selective information, without ever touching the actual facts of your life. Advertisers do this constantly, manufacturing manufactured insecurities to sell manufactured solutions. Political movements do this by framing ambiguous events as existential threats. Understanding that your emotions run on interpretation, not raw reality, is not just a tool for personal calm, it's a defense against being steered by anyone skilled enough to control your interpretations. So the brutal truth, stated plainly, the feeling that something is unbearable is not evidence that it is unbearable. It's evidence that you currently believe it's unbearable. Those are two very different claims, and confusing them is the source of an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering. Which brings us, naturally, to the truth underneath all the others, the one the Stoics returned to more than any other, because they believed it was the single fastest route to psychological freedom. You are already living on borrowed time. Law 3. You are already living on borrowed time. Every Stoic text you'll ever read, if you read enough of them, eventually arrives at death. Not as a morbid detour, but as the destination the whole philosophy was built to prepare you for. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself in the Meditations that he could leave life right now, and lets that thought govern what he does, says, and thinks in the present moment, rather than treating it as a distant abstraction. This wasn't poetic flourish. He was writing this literally while commanding armies through the Antonine Plague, one of the deadliest pandemics of the ancient world, which killed an estimated 5 million people, including, eventually, his own co-emperor Lucius Verus. The practice has a name, memento mori, remember you will die. It sounds grim to modern ears, trained to treat death as a subject to be managed by professionals in hospitals, kept out of everyday conversation, sanitized into euphemism. But the Stoics used the thought of death the way a physical trainer uses resistance. Not to injure you, but to build something through the friction. Here's the mechanism. Most people operate as though they have functionally unlimited time. This isn't a belief they'd defend if you asked them directly. Everyone knows, abstractly, that they'll die, but it's the belief their actual behavior reveals. We postpone the honest conversation. We delay the apology. We keep the resentment simmering because there will always be another chance to resolve it. We put off the thing that matters because the urgent thing is in front of us and the important thing can wait until someday. Seneca, in his essay on the shortness of life, makes an argument that still lands with full force 2,000 years later. Life is not short, we simply waste most of it. We spend enormous portions of our finite time on things we would never spend money that carelessly on, because time doesn't feel scarce the way money does right up until it's gone. There is real psychological research backing the counterintuitive claim that confronting mortality can improve, rather than worsen, present functioning. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pishinsky, starting in the 1980s, explores how awareness of death shapes behavior. And while much of that research documents the ways death awareness can trigger defensive, tribal, anxious responses when it's suppressed, and then triggered unexpectedly, a related and growing body of work on what's sometimes called death reflection finds that deliberate, non-panicked contemplation of mortality, as opposed to sudden, threatening reminders of it, is associated with increased gratitude, stronger prioritization of meaningful relationships over status-seeking, and clearer values. The difference seems to lie in whether the confrontation with death is chosen and processed, or intrusive and avoided. The Stoics were, in effect, running structured death reflection as a daily practice, long before anyone had a clinical term for it. This is the brutal part. You don't know how much time you have, and neither does anyone you love. Not vaguely, specifically. The person you're irritated with right now, the person you're avoiding a hard conversation with, the version of your life you keep postponing until conditions are more convenient. None of that has a guaranteed extension. Marcus Aurelius lost multiple children in infancy and childhood. Seneca wrote consolation letters to friends who had lost sons, and eventually wrote his own farewell as he was ordered to end his life. These men were not speculating about mortality from a safe distance. They were writing from inside a world with far higher and more visible death rates than most of us will ever personally witness, and their philosophy reflects that unavoidable proximity. We live, by contrast, in a culture engineered to keep death out of sight. Hospitals, funeral homes, insurance policies, all designed, with good intentions, to manage mortality so efficiently that most people can go years without directly confronting it. The cost of that convenience is that when death does arrive, close to us, or eventually for us, it arrives as a shock rather than as something we'd already made peace with. The Stoics would say, we've optimized for comfort in a way that leaves us catastrophically underprepared for the one certainty life guarantees. What does memento mori actually look like in daily practice, stripped of its morbid reputation? It's not walking around depressed about death. It's using the fact of death as a filter for decisions. Before you spend another year in a job that's slowly hollowing you out, ask, if I had unmistakable evidence that I had 5 years left, would I still spend the next one this way? Before you let another month pass, without calling the person you've drifted from, ask the same question. This isn't about becoming reckless or abandoning long-term planning. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire and planned for decades ahead. It's about refusing to let "there's always later" quietly consume the only time you actually have which is now, there's a second, sharper edge to this truth. If you are living on borrowed time, so is everyone else, including everyone you resent. The people who wronged you, the people you're waiting to see get what's coming to them, the people you've built elaborate grudges against. They too are running out the same finite clock you are. Holding on to resentment is, in a very literal sense, spending irreplaceable hours of your own scarce life on someone else's behavior. The Stoics weren't advocating forgiveness for the other person's sake, primarily. They were advocating it because resentment is expensive, and you are the one paying for it, in a currency you cannot get back. So, here is the truth stated without softening. You will die, probably without much warning, possibly sooner than feels fair. And the version of you reading this sentence has already used up a portion of a life that will not be extended for good behavior. That's not a reason to panic. It's a reason to stop treating your remaining time as though it were infinite, because the moment you actually accept that it isn't, priorities that used to seem important collapse, and priorities you'd been neglecting suddenly become obvious. Which brings us to a truth that sits right next to mortality, because both point at the same underlying problem, the gap between who you actually are and who you're pretending to be for an audience. Your self-image is a performance. Law 4. Your self-image is a performance. Here's an uncomfortable experiment. Think about how you'd behave if you knew with total certainty that no one would ever find out. Not your closest friend, not your family, not even the version of you that judges yourself in the mirror. Would your actions change? For almost everyone, the honest answer is yes, at least somewhat. And that gap, between how you act when watched and how you'd act when truly unwatched, is the size of the performance you've been mistaking for your character. The Stoics drew a sharp distinction between reputation and character, and they were unambiguous about which one actually mattered. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself repeatedly that it is not death that a person should fear, but never beginning to live in accordance with nature. And by nature, he meant reason and virtue, not the approval of an audience. He held the most exposed, most publicly scrutinized job in the entire Roman world, and his private notebook is, among other things, a record of him trying to strip away the performance that the role demanded and get back to something real underneath it. Modern psychology has a useful vocabulary for this gap. Sociologist Irving Goffman, in his 1959 work The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, described social life as a kind of ongoing theater where people manage front-stage behavior, curated for an audience, and backstage behavior, unguarded, private, often quite different. Goffman wasn't being cynical. He considered this basic to how social life functions. But he also noted the psychological cost when someone loses track of which version is real, what he called role engulfment, where the performance becomes so total that the person genuinely can't locate an authentic self underneath it anymore. You can see this everywhere once you're looking for it. Social media has turned identity performance into a full-time, unpaid job. A highlight reel curated for strangers, competing with everyone else's highlight reel, none of it representing anyone's actual daily experience. Researchers studying social comparison on these platforms have repeatedly found associations between heavy social media use and increased anxiety and depressive symptoms, particularly among people who engage in frequent upward comparison, measuring their unfiltered inner life against other people's filtered outer presentation. You are, quite literally, comparing your backstage to everyone else's front stage and losing But this isn't only a phone problem. It's older and deeper than that. The performance shows up in the career you chose because it sounded impressive at dinner parties, rather than because it suited you. It shows up in the opinions you voice in a group because they're the socially safe opinions, not necessarily the ones you actually hold. It shows up in the version of grief or confidence or contentment you display because that's what's expected, even when what you feel privately is something messier. Epictetus, a former slave who understood better than most philosophers the difference between what is genuinely yours and what can be stripped away by others, made a distinction that cuts right through this. Your true self is your capacity for judgment and choice, the part of you no external force can touch. Your reputation, your title, your possessions, even your body, belong to the category of things that can be taken from you by circumstance. If you've built your entire identity on the performance, the reputation, the image, the curated version, you've built your sense of self on the one category of things guaranteed to be unstable. The brutal part of this truth is that most people never find out how much of their personality was performance until the audience disappears. Retirement, relocation, the end of a defining relationship, a public failure. These events strip away the stage, and what's left is either a person who still has something solid underneath, or a person who suddenly doesn't recognize themselves without an audience to perform for. Seneca warned his friend Lucilius about exactly this in his letters. Don't live for the good opinion of the crowd, because the crowd is fickle, and a self built to please a fickle audience will be exactly as stable as that audience's mood. How do you find the gap between your performance and your actual character? One honest method. Notice where you behave differently, depending on who's watching. Do you speak to service workers the way you speak to people who can advance your career? Do you tell the truth as readily in private as you claim to in public? Do your stated values match your unwatched behavior, or only your watched behavior? The distance between those two is roughly the size of the performance you're carrying around, and carrying a performance is exhausting. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance about being caught in the gap. There's a liberating flip side to this brutal truth, though it takes some work to get there. If your self-image is largely performance, that means it can be renegotiated. You are not permanently welded to whatever persona you built in your 20s, or whatever role your family assigned you, or whatever image your job requires. The part of you the Stoics considered genuinely yours, your judgment, your choices, your capacity to reason about what's actually good, remains available to you at any point, regardless of how long you've been performing something else. The work isn't discovering some hidden, perfectly formed, authentic self waiting to be unveiled. The work is gradually closing the gap between your stated values and your unwatched behavior, one honest choice at a time, until the performance and the person underneath it stop needing to be different from each other. That closing of the gap is hard precisely because performance is comfortable and honesty often isn't, which is a perfect bridge to our next truth, because comfort itself, it turns out, is doing more damage to you than most of what you're afraid of. You suffer more in imagination than in reality. Law 5. You suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca wrote a line to his friend Lucilius that deserves to be carved somewhere you'll see it every day. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. He wasn't speculating. He was describing something he'd watched happen to himself repeatedly. The dread before an event turning out to be worse, sharper, and longer lasting than the event itself. Think about the last time you were anxious about something for days. A difficult conversation, a medical test, a presentation, a confrontation you knew was coming. Now compare the total suffering you experienced during the anticipation to the suffering you experienced during the actual event. For most people, the honest tally isn't close. The dread ran for days. The event itself lasted 20 minutes and was, however uncomfortable, survivable and finite. You paid an enormous, prolonged psychological tax on an event that turned out to be a small, brief transaction. This isn't a coincidence of how your particular mind works. It's a structural feature of imagination itself. When you anticipate a feared event, your mind doesn't run one simulation. It runs dozens unconsciously, stacking worst-case branch after worst-case branch, because imagined threats don't have the natural constraints that real events have. Reality can only go one way at a time. Imagination can go 1,000 ways simultaneously, and your nervous system, unable to fully distinguish a vividly imagined threat from an actual one, responds to the worst version of all of them, more or less continuously, until the real event finally arrives and puts a stop to the multiplication. Modern anxiety research maps directly onto this. The clinical concept of anticipatory anxiety describes exactly this pattern. Distress generated not by a present threat, but by mental simulation of a future one. And it's a well-documented driver of generalized anxiety disorder. Studies using ecological momentary assessment, where people report their worry in real time throughout the day, rather than relying on memory afterward, consistently find that the majority of things people worry about either never happen or happen in a form significantly less severe than what was imagined. The worry itself produces no protective benefit proportional to its cost. It just runs in the background, consuming attention and elevating stress hormones for an event that, more often than not, resolves itself without the catastrophe. The Stoics had a countermeasure for this, and it's the same premeditatio malorum from Law 1, but applied here with a slightly different purpose. Rather than using imagination to spiral through infinite worst cases, you deliberately and briefly imagine one specific, realistic worst case, all the way through to its end, including your own survival of it. This sounds paradoxical. Doesn't imagining the bad outcome make you more anxious? In practice, it's the opposite, and there's a reason. Uncontrolled anticipatory worry is diffuse, repetitive, and never resolves. It just loops. Deliberate premeditation is bounded. You walk through the worst realistic case once. Notice what you'd actually do if it happened, and then you're done. The difference is between a fire alarm that never stops ringing and a fire drill that has a clear beginning and end. Here's a brutal detail worth sitting with. Much of what you're currently dreading will never happen at all. Researchers who've tracked worry outcomes across weeks find that a large majority of anticipated bad events simply don't occur. And among the ones that do occur, most people report that they coped better than they expected to. Your imagination is, in a very literal sense, an unreliable narrator when it comes to forecasting your own future. And yet, you grant it the authority of a fact-checker every single day. There's a deeper Stoic point buried in this, and it connects back to Law 2. If emotions are opinions rather than facts, then anticipatory dread is an opinion about an event that hasn't happened yet, which means it's even further removed from reality than ordinary emotional reactions. You are not responding to a fact. You are responding to a prediction generated by a part of your mind that has strong incentives toward catastrophizing. Because a nervous system that overestimates threats survives more often. Evolutionarily, than one that underestimates them, and essentially no incentive toward accuracy. What do you actually do with this? First, when you notice yourself spiraling about a future event, name it precisely. This is imagination, not reality. That single act of labeling, psychologists sometimes call this cognitive diffusion. Separating yourself from a thought rather than fusing with it as though it were simply true, creates a small but real gap between you and the spiral, enough to interrupt it. Second, run the premeditation deliberately rather than letting worry run wild. Sit down, once, and walk through the specific worst realistic outcome of the thing you're dreading. Not the vague, catastrophic version your anxious mind keeps generating, a specific, bounded one. Then ask, if that happened, what would I actually do next? Nearly always, there is an answer, and finding it drains most of the terror out of the scenario, because terror thrives on vagueness and starves on specificity. Third, track your own track record. Keep a simple, honest log of things you've dreaded and how they actually turned out. Most people, doing this exercise seriously for even a month, discover their internal forecaster has been wildly, consistently wrong, over-predicting disaster and under-predicting their own capacity to handle whatever actually shows up. That log becomes evidence you can use against the next spiral, because you're no longer arguing with the anxious voice on faith. You have data, the brutal truth underneath all of this. You have likely spent more total hours of your life suffering over things that never happened than suffering over things that did. That is not a minor inefficiency. That is, for many people, the single largest thief of their waking hours, larger than any external circumstance has ever managed to be, which leads directly into the next truth. Because if imagination can manufacture suffering out of nothing, it's worth asking where imagination gets its material from in the first place. And the answer is less personal and more borrowed than you'd like to believe. Most of your desires are not actually yours. Law 6. Most of your desires are not actually yours. Ask yourself honestly, the job you want, the car you want, the body you want, the relationship status you want. How many of those desires did you arrive at through independent reflection, and how many did you simply absorb from the people and culture around you? The Stoics were deeply suspicious of desire, not because they thought wanting things was inherently wrong, but because they'd noticed something uncomfortable. Most human desire is imitative rather than original. Epictetus repeatedly warns against wanting things merely because others have them or praise them, arguing that a desire adopted second-hand from the crowd carries the crowd's instability along with it. You'll be as anxious about losing the thing as everyone else who wanted it for the same borrowed reasons. This idea found a rigorous modern formulation in the work of French historian and philosopher René Girard, who developed what he called mimetic desire theory. The observation that human beings largely don't generate our desires from some pure internal source, but rather copy them from other people we admire or envy. We don't want a thing because it's intrinsically valuable to us. We want it because we've watched someone else want it, or have it, or be admired for it, and our own desire is a copy of theirs, often without our awareness that any copying occurred. Girard argued this mimetic structure explains an enormous amount of human conflict, because when two people copy each other's desire for the same scarce thing, they become rivals almost by definition. Not because the thing itself was so essential, but because the wanting was borrowed and now has nowhere else to go. You can see mimetic desire operating everywhere once you know to look. The career path you assumed was ambition might be an inherited assumption from a parent who never told you they wanted something different for themselves, and passed the unlived desire on to you instead. The lifestyle you're saving for might be less about what would actually make your daily life better, and more about matching an image you've absorbed from people around you, or from a screen. Advertising, at its most sophisticated, doesn't sell products. It sells the image of a person you're implicitly told to want to become, betting correctly that you'll mistake the manufactured aspiration for your own. There's a related concept psychology worth mentioning here. Acquired needs theory and research on materialism consistently find that goals oriented around external validation, wealth, image, popularity, correlate with lower well-being than goals oriented around what psychologists call intrinsic values: growth, connection, community, competence. The unsettling implication is that a large share of the striving people do across their entire lives is aimed at targets that, even when hit, don't reliably deliver the satisfaction that was promised, because the desire for them was never really generated by an accurate forecast of what would make life better. It was generated by watching other people want those same things and assuming they must know something you don't. The Stoics' proposed remedy wasn't to eliminate desire entirely. Despite the popular caricature, they weren't advocating for a kind of monk-like renunciation of all wanting. Their remedy was to interrogate desire before acting on it. Is this something I actually need for a good life, judged by my own reasoned values? Or is this something I've absorbed because everyone around me seems to want it, and I assumed their consensus meant something? Marcus Aurelius, ruling from the most envied position in the ancient world, repeatedly reminds himself in the Meditations that fame, luxury, and the praise of the crowd are worth almost nothing when examined closely, not as false modesty, but as an honest audit of what actually produces a life worth living, versus what merely looks that way from the outside. Here's the brutal part. If you actually did this audit honestly on your own life, a significant portion of what you're currently chasing would probably not survive the interrogation. Not because those things are worthless in some abstract sense, but because you discover you don't actually want many of them for the reasons you thought you did. You want the promotion partly because a sibling has one. You want the house partly because a friend group has normalized a certain size and neighborhood as the marker of having made it. You want the relationship status partly because being single past a certain age has been coded by people around you as a kind of failure, regardless of whether your actual daily experience of single life is good or bad. This is uncomfortable because it threatens a core piece of self-mythology, the story that your ambitions are the product of your own unique, independent judgment. Girard's whole point, and the Stoics' point, centuries earlier, is that almost nobody's desires work that way, and pretending otherwise just makes you more susceptible to having your wants shaped by whoever is skilled at modeling desirability to you. Advertisers, influencers, status-conscious peer groups, even well-meaning family. The practical move here isn't to distrust every desire you have. It's to run a simple test on the ones that feel most urgent. If no one would ever know I had this, no admiration, no comparison, no audience, would I still want it? Desires that survive that test tend to be closer to genuinely yours. Creative work you'd do unrecognized, relationships you'd nurture with no one watching, skills you'd build for their own sake. Desires that evaporate under that test were likely borrowed, and borrowed desires make exhausting, unstable foundations for a life, because you're perpetually chasing a moving target set by someone else's approval. Which brings us to the mechanism underneath nearly all borrowed desire, the engine that makes it so hard to resist in the first place. Your addiction to being seen well by others. Law 7. You are addicted to external validation. Let's name the addiction plainly, because calling it by a softer name won't help you break it. You check for approval the way a smoker checks for a cigarette. The like count, the reply, the nod from the room after you've said something you hoped landed well. The promotion that tells you, in a language you trust more than your own judgment, that you matter. The Stoics saw this coming from a long way off because they lived in a culture, Imperial Rome, that was arguably even more obsessed with public reputation than ours, structured around patron-client relationships, where your entire social and economic standing depended on visible approval from people above you in the hierarchy. Epictetus, who had lived as a slave and understood precisely how little control a person can have over their circumstances, drew a sharp line. Praise and blame from others belong to the category of things not up to you, and building your sense of worth on things not up to you guarantees instability, because the crowd's opinion shifts for reasons that have nothing to do with your actual conduct. Here's the mechanism, in plain terms. Every time you receive approval, a compliment, social media validation, applause, a good performance review, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter implicated in every other reward-seeking behavior, including substance addiction. This isn't metaphorical. Neuroscience research on social media use has found that receiving likes and positive social feedback activates reward circuitry, including the nucleus accumbens, in patterns strikingly similar to those seen with other reinforcing rewards. The system wasn't built for infinite, on-demand social approval. It evolved in small groups where genuine social standing was slow-forming and stable. Now it's hooked up to a machine that can deliver a hit of that same signal every few seconds, and the system responds exactly the way any reward system responds to a supernormal stimulus. It wants more, faster, and it recalibrates its baseline so that ordinary, unremarkable days start to feel flat by comparison. Seneca had a term for the specific poison of chasing this. He called excessive attention to public opinion a kind of servitude, arguing that a person who needs the crowd's approval has effectively handed the crowd control over their emotional state, becoming as unstable as the crowd's mood, which is to say, extremely unstable. This is the brutal part. If your sense of worth rises and falls with external validation, you are not actually the author of your own emotional life. Whoever is currently withholding or granting approval is. You can see the shape of this addiction most clearly by watching what happens during withdrawal. Take away someone's audience, a public failure, a platform ban, a period of being professionally sidelined, simple obscurity, and watch how disoriented some people become. Not because their actual circumstances changed that dramatically, but because the validation supply that had been propping up their sense of self got cut off. Compare this to how a person with an internally grounded sense of worth handles the same external drop. Uncomfortable, certainly, but not existentially destabilized, because their self-assessment was never fully outsourced in the first place. Marcus Aurelius, who occupied the single most publicly visible position in the ancient world, wrote to himself constantly about the emptiness of posthumous fame and the fickleness of even contemporary praise. Not because he was falsely humble, but because he understood, from the inside, exactly how corrosive it is to let your internal compass be set by an audience that will praise you one day and turn on you the next, for reasons that have little to do with your actual character. He reminds himself that the people whose approval you're chasing are themselves confused, changeable, and often driven by their own anxieties rather than sound judgment. So their approval, even when you get it, is not the reliable signal of worth it feels like in the moment. There's a useful diagnostic question here. Notice how much of your behavior changes when you believe you're being observed versus when you believe you're not. If the gap is large, you've located exactly how much of your self-regard currently depends on external supply rather than internal standard. This connects directly back to Law 4's discussion of performance. Validation seeking is the engine that keeps the performance running, because a performance without an audience providing feedback simply stops. What's the alternative, according to the Stoics? Not indifference to others, and not an aggressive contempt for what people think. That's just validation seeking running in reverse, still organized entirely around the crowd's reaction, just flipped to defiance instead of compliance. The actual alternative is building an internal standard of judgment, robust enough that external approval becomes pleasant when it arrives, but unnecessary for your stability. This requires doing the harder, slower work of Law 4, closing the gap between your private and public behavior until there's no longer a meaningful difference, which means you no longer need an audience to confirm you did the right thing, because you already know. Practically, this starts small. Do one thing well specifically, when no one is watching and no one will find out, and notice the different quality of satisfaction that comes from that, compared to a public win. Go a defined period, a day, a week, without checking whatever platform currently supplies your validation hits, and notice the withdrawal symptoms, because naming them as withdrawal symptoms rather than simply boredom or curiosity tells you the truth about what's actually happening. Practice receiving both praise and criticism with the same brief level response. Epictetus recommended treating both compliments and insults as equally beside the point, since neither one changes your actual character, only the crowd's temporary read on it. The brutal truth to sit with. If you removed every source of external validation from your life tomorrow, no likes, no applause, no promotions, no one watching, would you still recognize the person who remained? And would that person still consider their own conduct worthwhile? If the honest answer is uncertain, that uncertainty is the addiction talking, and it's worth taking seriously, because the supply of external validation is, by definition, never fully in your control, which brings us to a truth that sits right beside this one and cuts even closer to the bone. Your anger, especially the righteous kind, is not strength. It's a confession of weakness. Law 8. Your anger is a confession of weakness. Nobody wants to hear this one, so let's get it out cleanly. Anger feels like power in the moment it's happening, and that feeling is almost always a lie. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on this, De Ira, on anger, prompted by his brother's request for advice on how to manage it, and Seneca's answer is uncompromising. He calls anger the most destructive of all emotions, more damaging than any other passion, because unlike fear or grief, which tend to make people passive, anger actively drives people toward destructive action. And it does this while producing a powerful, convincing illusion of righteousness, strength, and clarity, exactly when the person experiencing it is at their least clear-headed. Here's the mechanism Seneca identified, and it's remarkably compatible with what neuroscience now understands about acute stress responses. Anger arises, he argued, in two stages: an initial involuntary jolt, a spike of heat, an impulse toward retaliation, which he considered blameless, simply a reflex of the body responding to a perceived affront. But then comes the second stage, a decision, made so quickly it doesn't feel like a decision, to endorse that jolt as justified and to act on it. That second stage, Seneca insisted, is where moral responsibility actually lives, because it's a choice, however fast, and choices can be examined, delayed, and in many cases reversed before they cause damage. Why does anger present itself as strength when it's actually the opposite? Because it temporarily numbs a more vulnerable feeling underneath it. Psychologists who study anger frequently describe it as a secondary emotion, one that often sits on top of a more threatening primary emotion like fear, humiliation, grief, or powerlessness. Anger feels active and commanding, the feelings underneath it, feeling small, feeling disrespected, feeling afraid of losing something, feel passive and exposed. The mind, given the choice between sitting with vulnerability and converting it into righteous fury, very often takes the fury, because fury feels like doing something, even when the underlying situation calls for a completely different response. Seneca made a specific, almost clinical observation worth remembering. He noted that the angriest reactions tend to come not from the strongest people, but from the people who feel weakest and most threatened. Children throw the most violent tantrums over the smallest slights. The sick and the frail flare up faster than the healthy, and those already anxious about their status lash out hardest at perceived challenges to it. Anger, in his framework, is not a display of strength overpowering a threat. It's a display of a nervous system that has already concluded, at some level, that it is under threat and lacks a calmer, more effective response available to it. This connects to something you can verify in your own life without needing to trust ancient philosophy on faith. Notice the situations that actually make you angriest, and ask honestly what's underneath the anger. Very often, beneath the surface fury at a partner's forgetfulness sits a fear of not mattering to them. Beneath fury at a colleague's success sits a fear about your own inadequacy or stalled progress. Beneath fury at being contradicted in an argument sits a fear that you might actually be wrong, and wrongness threatens a sense of competence you're not ready to have questioned. The anger is loud, specifically, because the fear underneath it is something you'd rather not examine directly. There's a further brutal layer here. Anger, however satisfying it feels in the moment, is a remarkably poor tool for actually achieving what you want. Seneca points out that anger, unlike calculated, controlled action, tends to overshoot. It doesn't stop precisely where justice or effectiveness would require. It keeps escalating past the point of usefulness, because its internal logic is retaliation and vindication rather than a considered assessment of what response would actually solve the problem. A furious response to a subordinate's mistake damages the relationship far beyond what the mistake warranted. A furious response to a partner's slight often inflicts more lasting harm on the relationship than the original slight did. Modern research on decision-making under high arousal states backs this up consistently. People in states of heightened anger take on more risk, judge others more harshly, and are significantly worse at accurately assessing probability and consequence than people in calmer states. Meaning, the very moment's anger convinces you that decisive action is required are the moments you are least equipped to decide well. None of this means suppressing anger, gritting your teeth, and pretending it isn't there. Seneca was explicit that suppression isn't the goal, because a suppressed jolt still colors judgment even when it's not expressed outwardly. The goal is catching the gap between the first involuntary jolt and the second-stage decision to act on it, and using that gap, even if it's only a few seconds, to ask what's actually underneath the anger and what response would actually address that underlying thing rather than simply discharging the feeling onto whoever happens to be nearby. Practically, the next time you feel the heat rise, before speaking or acting, name what's underneath it. Not "I'm angry," but "I'm angry because I feel disrespected," or "I'm angry because I'm afraid this relationship is slipping," or "I'm angry because this threatens how competent I believe myself to be." That single act of naming does two things. It slows down the automatic escalation from jolt to action, and it points you toward the actual problem, which anger, left unexamined, will never solve and will usually make worse. The brutal truth to carry forward. The loudest, most self-righteous version of you is very often the most frightened version of you, wearing a costume that feels like power. Real strength, in the Stoic sense, looks much quieter than that, which sets up the next truth directly. Because quiet strength requires a level of consistency between what you claim to value and what you actually do under pressure, and that consistency is far rarer than most people, including you, would like to admit. Law 9. You will betray your principles under pressure. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. If you were tested the way Epictetus was tested, enslaved, his leg reportedly broken by a master, his entire physical autonomy stripped away, would your stated principles have survived intact? Most people assume yes, because most people have never actually been tested that hard, and untested principles are cheap. They cost nothing to declare and nothing to believe in, right up until circumstances demand you pay for them. The Stoics were unusually honest about this gap between stated values and pressure-tested behavior, because several of them lived through genuine pressure and watched, often painfully, where the gap actually was. Seneca is the sharpest case study here, and it's worth sitting with the discomfort of his story rather than skipping past it. He wrote eloquently, for decades, about indifference to wealth, about the corrupting danger of proximity to tyrannical power, about the philosopher's duty to speak truth regardless of consequence. He was also, simultaneously, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, an advisor to Nero during some of the emperor's most brutal years, and a man whose actual conduct under the pressure of proximity to absolute power did not always match the philosophy he taught. Historians still debate how much of this was compromise, how much was survival, and how much was self-deception. But the gap itself is not seriously disputed, and Seneca himself, to his credit, acknowledged it in his own letters, describing himself as someone who talked about the good life far more capably than he lived it. This isn't offered here to discredit Seneca. It's offered because it's a far more useful lesson than a story about a philosopher who effortlessly lived up to his own standards would have been. The lesson is, stated values are not the same thing as tested character, and the distance between them only becomes visible when real pressure, money, power, fear, social cost is actually applied. Most people go their entire lives without finding out how large that gap is in themselves, because most people are rarely pressure-tested in ways severe enough to reveal it. Psychology has documented this gap under a less forgiving name. The difference between people's self-reported values and their actual behavior under controlled experimental pressure is often startling. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s are the most famous case. Ordinary people, none of whom would have described themselves in advance as willing to inflict serious harm on a stranger, delivered what they believed were dangerous or lethal electric shocks to another person, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat calmly instructed them to continue. The majority complied fully. These were not unusually cruel people. They were ordinary people whose stated values about harming innocents did not survive contact with a specific, structured form of social pressure, proximity to authority, gradual escalation, and diffusion of responsibility. This connects to a broader and less comfortable finding across social psychology. Situational pressure predicts behavior far more reliably, in many contexts, than personality traits or stated moral convictions do. This doesn't mean character is fictional, or that principles are pointless. It means untested principles are far weaker than people assume, and the gap between believing something and doing it under pressure is exactly where character is actually built or exposed. Not in the comfortable moments when no pressure exists to test it. The Stoic response to this brutal fact was not despair, it was training. Epictetus insisted that philosophy is not a matter of clever argument to be admired at dinner parties, but a discipline to be practiced daily, specifically because he understood that a principle you have only thought about, never rehearsed, will not hold up the first time reality pushes against it. This is why the Stoics developed practices like premeditatio malorum, Law 1, not abstract exercises, but literal rehearsals for pressure, so that when the actual pressure arrived, the response had already been practiced in miniature, rather than being improvised for the first time under duress. Here's the brutal, specific implication for you. The principles you're proudest of holding are until tested, unverified. You believe you'd tell the truth, even when lying would be easier. You believe you'd stay loyal to a friend, even when loyalty became socially costly. You believe you'd refuse to participate in something unethical, even if your job depended on going along with it. Some of those beliefs will hold. Some, under the actual pressure of a mortgage payment, a furious boss, or a room full of people going along with something you privately know is wrong, will not, and you will very likely not know which category a given principle falls into until the moment arrives, unannounced, and asks you to pay for it. What do you do with this, practically, before the moment arrives? First, get specific about which of your principles have never actually been tested, and treat that untested status honestly, rather than assuming they'd hold simply because you believe they would. Second, practice smaller-scale versions of the pressure deliberately. Tell an uncomfortable truth in a low-stakes situation. Decline a minor social expectation you disagree with. Notice how much discomfort those small tests produce, because that discomfort is data about how much larger discomfort a bigger test would produce. Third, when you do fail a test, and everyone does, repeatedly across a lifetime, resist both extremes, neither excusing it away as inevitable and meaningless, nor treating a single failure as proof that your character is worthless. Seneca's own life suggests a third option: naming the failure honestly, using it as more accurate information about where your actual limits currently sit, and building from there rather than either denying the gap or being destroyed by it. The brutal truth, stated plainly: you do not actually know how principled you are. You know how principled you believe yourself to be, which is a different and far less reliable measurement. Real character is revealed only under real pressure, and most of your self-image about your own integrity has simply never been billed for the cost of proving it. Which sets up the final truth of this part. Because if you can be this uncertain about your own principles under pressure, the voice inside your head, that constantly judges and second-guesses you deserves exactly the same scrutiny, because it is claiming an authority over you that it has not remotely earned. Law 10. Your inner critic is not wisdom, it's fear in disguise. There's a voice most people carry that narrates their failures in real time, in a tone far harsher than they'd ever use on a friend. It tells you the mistake you made proves something permanent about your worth. It tells you the rejection you experienced confirms what it's always suspected about you. It sounds, in the moment, like honesty, like the one voice in your head that refuses to flatter you and insists on telling you the unpleasant truth. This law argues that voice is almost never telling you the truth. It's running a fear program and dressing it up as wisdom. The Stoics were sharply aware of the danger of an untrained inner voice, though they framed the problem slightly differently than modern psychology does. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself repeatedly that the mind, left unexamined, will generate a constant stream of judgments, many of them false, exaggerated, or simply unhelpful, and that the discipline of philosophy is largely the discipline of examining those judgments before accepting them as accurate reports about reality. He explicitly distinguishes between the event and the interpretation layered on top of it, the same distinction from Law 2, and applies it here with unusual sharpness. The harsh internal narration after a failure is not a neutral report of fact. It's an interpretation generated by a frightened part of the mind, and it deserves exactly as much automatic trust as any other unverified claim, which is to say, none until it's been examined. Modern cognitive psychology gives this a specific name and a specific origin story. The inner critic is now understood across multiple therapeutic traditions as largely a defensive structure, a voice that developed, often in childhood, as a way of preempting external criticism or punishment by delivering the harsh judgment internally first, faster and more thoroughly than any external critic could. The logic, formed early and non-consciously, goes something like, if I attack myself before anyone else can, I retain some control over the pain, and maybe I can head off worse punishment by proving I already know I'm at fault. This can be an adaptive strategy for a child with limited power to control their environment. It is a catastrophically poor strategy for an adult because it never actually stops delivering the harsh judgment once the original threat, a punishing parent, a harsh teacher, an unstable home, is long gone. The mechanism keeps running on the same setting indefinitely, aimed now at situations that don't remotely warrant that level of internal punishment. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The inner critic is not more accurate than a kinder internal voice would be. It just feels more credible, because harshness has been culturally coded, particularly in certain families and professional environments, as a marker of honesty and rigor, while kindness gets coded as softness or self-indulgence. But there is no actual correlation between how harshly a judgment is delivered and how true it is. You failed because you're fundamentally not good enough, and you failed because this particular attempt didn't work, and here's what you can adjust, are not different in accuracy. The second is, in fact, almost always more accurate, because it's specific and falsifiable, while the first is a sweeping, unfalsifiable character verdict that no single failure could actually prove. Psychological research on self-compassion developed extensively by researcher Kristin Neff over the past 2 decades has produced a finding that should embarrass the inner critic's entire premise. People who respond to their own failures with self-compassion rather than harsh self-criticism are not less motivated, less disciplined, or more prone to repeating mistakes, as the inner critic insists they would be. Across numerous studies, the opposite tends to hold. Self-compassionate responses to failure are associated with greater resilience, more accurate self-assessment, and a higher likelihood of trying again after setbacks, while harsh self-criticism is associated with increased avoidance, higher anxiety, and paradoxically, worse subsequent performance, because a mind under constant threat of internal punishment becomes more focused on defending itself than on learning. This connects directly to the Stoic model, because the Stoics never actually argued for harshness toward yourself. That's another popular misreading. Marcus Aurelius's private notebook, Read in Full, is strikingly gentle toward its author. He corrects himself, notes his failures, and redirects his attention. But he does not spiral into the kind of self-flagellating language modern inner critics specialize in. The tone throughout the meditations is closer to a patient coach correcting form than a prosecutor delivering a verdict. This matters because it suggests the actual Stoic discipline was never be harder on yourself. It was examine your judgments accurately, and an accurate examination of a mistake almost never produces the sweeping, permanent, identity-level condemnation the inner critic reaches for by default. So, what do you do with the voice? First, notice its favorite move, converting a specific temporary event into a permanent, global verdict about your worth. I made a mistake in this presentation becomes, in the critic's translation, I am bad at my job, or I am not smart enough. A leap in scope the original event never justified. Catching that leap in real time and consciously reducing the claim back down to its actual, specific size is the single most useful move available. Second, borrow a standard from outside yourself. Would you say this sentence, in this tone, to a friend who came to you with the same failure? If not, you are not applying a standard of honesty. You're applying a standard of punishment. And calling it honesty is exactly the disguise this law is naming. Third, treat the inner critic's harshness as information about fear, not information about truth. The same reframe from Lorate's treatment of anger. A loud, punishing internal voice after a mistake usually signals that some old threat of not being good enough, of being exposed, of losing belonging, has been triggered, not that an accurate verdict has been reached. Responding to the fear underneath, rather than obeying the verdict on top, is the actual Stoic move, and it is available to you every single time that voice starts speaking. That closes the truths about yourself. You've now looked, without flinching, at how little you control, how manufactured your emotions and desires often are, how thin the line is between your character and your performance, and how unreliable your own inner narrator can be. The next part turns the same unflinching lens outward, because the people around you are running the exact same unreliable systems, and understanding that changes everything about how you should expect them to treat you. Part 2. The truths about other people. Law 11. People will disappoint you. Expect it without excusing it. Here's a distinction most self-help material gets wrong, and it's worth getting right from the start of this part. Expecting disappointment from people is not the same as excusing it, and confusing the two leaves you either naively wounded or coldly detached, when the Stoic position was neither. Marcus Aurelius opens the 5th book of the Meditations with a passage that startles people the first time they read it. He tells himself, before getting out of bed each morning, that he will meet people who are ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable. And rather than treating this as a reason for despair, he treats it as simple, useful preparation the same way you'd check the weather before deciding what to wear. He goes further. He reminds himself that he cannot be genuinely harmed by another person's wrongdoing, unless he allows their wrongdoing to corrupt his own character in response. Their fault is theirs, and it remains theirs, regardless of how he responds to it. This is a remarkably practical piece of psychological engineering. Most disappointment in other people isn't actually caused by their behavior. It's caused by the gap between their behavior and an expectation you were carrying that they never agreed to meet. You expected a friend to remember an important date. You expected a colleague to give you credit. You expected family to show up the way you would have shown up for them. When the gap opens between the expectation and the reality, the pain you feel isn't really about the other person's specific action. It's about the violated assumption, and assumptions, unlike other people's behavior, are entirely within your own control to calibrate. This is not the same as saying you should expect the worst from everyone and treat people with cynical suspicion. Marcus Aurelius, in the very same passage, goes on to remind himself that he is still bound to these same difficult people by a shared rational nature, and that his job is to work alongside them, correct them where he reasonably can, and refuse to let their failures degrade his own conduct, not to withdraw from them in disgust. The Stoic position threads a genuinely difficult needle. Hold realistic, low expectations about how consistently other people will meet high standards, while still holding yourself and treating others according to those high standards, regardless of what you receive back. Here's where the without excusing it. Half of this law's title matters, because it's easy to slide from realistic expectations into a kind of passive doormat philosophy. People will disappoint me, so I shouldn't hold them accountable when they do. That's not what the Stoics argued, and it's worth being precise here. Seneca wrote at length about the difference between the wise response to wrongdoing and simple passivity. The wise person still corrects wrongdoing where correction is possible, still withdraws from relationships that are consistently harmful, still enforces consequences where consequences are warranted. What the Stoics rejected wasn't accountability, it was the emotional devastation of being shocked each time that human beings behave like human beings. Modern psychology has a useful related concept here: expectation violation, a well-studied driver of disproportionate emotional reactions. Research on relationship satisfaction consistently finds that unmet expectations, more than the objective severity of a partner's or friend's actual behavior, predict how hurt or angry people feel in response. Two people can experience an identical broken promise. The one who had unconsciously assumed perfect reliability from the other person experiences it as a devastating betrayal, while the one who had calibrated a more realistic expectation experiences the same event as a disappointing but survivable data point. The event was the same. The suffering was different, and the difference traces almost entirely back to the expectation, not the behavior. There's a harder layer to this brutal truth worth naming directly. Some of your disappointment in other people is actually disappointment in yourself for having expected something you had enough evidence, if you'd been honest, to know wasn't likely. If a person has shown you repeatedly, over years, that they're unreliable, and you keep being freshly devastated each time they're unreliable again, the Stoics would gently point out that the fault has shifted at least partly onto your own refusal to update your expectations based on the evidence already available to you. This isn't victim blaming for genuine harm done to you. It's a specific, narrower claim about the difference between being hurt by a first betrayal and being repeatedly shocked by a pattern you've already had ample evidence of. So what does calibrated expectation actually look like in practice? It means basing your predictions about how someone will treat you on their demonstrated track record, not on their stated intentions, not on how you'd behave in their position, and not on how much you want them to be reliable. It means holding people accountable for falling short of agreements. A calibrated expectation is not a license for others to mistreat you, while not being emotionally leveled each time an already unreliable person is, once again, unreliable. And it means directing your own conduct according to your own standards, regardless of what standard the people around you are operating on, which is precisely what Marcus Aurelius meant when he said another person's wrongdoing cannot actually harm you unless you let it degrade your own character in response. The brutal truth to carry forward. Most people are operating with less self-awareness, less consistency, and less capacity for the reliability you'd like from them than you assume, not because people are malicious, but because most people are dealing with their own version of every truth in part 1 of this book. Their own borrowed desires, their own untested principles, their own harsh inner critics. And that internal chaos leaks into how they treat you, whether they intend it to or not. Expecting disappointment isn't cynicism. It's simply accounting for the fact that everyone around you is exactly as psychologically complicated and imperfect as you discovered yourself to be in the first 10 laws. Which brings us to a related and even less comfortable truth about the structure of relationships themselves. One that most people resist acknowledging, even when the evidence for it is sitting right in front of them. Most relationships, even the ones that feel sacred, are running on some form of exchange. Law 12. Most relationships are transactional, even the ones that feel sacred. This law will make some readers uncomfortable, and that discomfort is worth sitting with rather than deflecting, because the discomfort is usually a sign that the truth is landing somewhere real. The word transactional has been given a purely negative connotation in modern relationship language. We use it to describe cold, calculating people who only give when they expect something back. But strip the negative judgment away and look at the underlying mechanics, honestly, and something uncomfortable becomes visible. Nearly all sustained human relationships, including the ones we consider most sacred, close friendships, marriages, family bonds, involve an ongoing exchange of value, and relationships that become chronically one-sided, where one party gives consistently more than they receive across every dimension that matters to them, do not tend to survive intact, or, if they survive as a source of quiet resentment for whoever is on the losing end of the exchange. The Stoics weren't naive romantics about friendship, even though friendship mattered enormously to them. Seneca's letters to Lucilius are themselves an extended act of friendship, and he wrote seriously about how to choose friends wisely. But he was explicit that friendship should be entered with judgment, not blind sentiment. Choose your friends carefully, he advised, because you take on their character to some degree through the association, and a poorly chosen friendship costs you more than it gives. This is not romantic language. It's the language of someone evaluating an exchange and advising his reader to evaluate it too. Modern relationship psychology has formalized this observation under social exchange theory, developed by sociologists including George Homans and later refined by Thibault and Kelly, which models relationships as an ongoing weighing of rewards against costs, with satisfaction tracking, not the absolute level of reward received, but the comparison between what you're receiving and what you believe you could reasonably expect, either from this relationship at its best or from realistic alternatives. This sounds cold when stated in academic language, but it explains something everyone has actually experienced. A relationship can objectively involve good things: companionship, support, shared history, and still feel unsatisfying if the exchange feels sufficiently unbalanced, or if one party privately believes they could receive a better exchange elsewhere and are staying out of habit, guilt, or fear rather than genuine ongoing choice. Here's the part that stings the most. This applies to family relationships too, the ones our culture insists should operate on unconditional love rather than exchange. And to some extent, they do operate differently. Most people extend more slack, more forgiveness, more one-sided giving to family than they would to a friend or a colleague, and that extra slack is real and meaningful. But even family relationships have a breaking point where the exchange becomes so lopsided that the bond frays regardless of blood ties. Adult children who go low contact with parents after years of one-sided emotional labor, siblings who drift apart after one consistently shows up and the other consistently doesn't. Unconditional love, examined honestly, turns out to have more conditions than the phrase implies. Even in the relationships we consider most exempt from the ordinary rules of exchange. Why does naming this matter practically? Because pretending your relationships operate outside the logic of exchange. Believing real love or real friendship shouldn't require any accounting of what's given and received sets you up for exactly the kind of slow-building resentment that quietly poisons relationships from the inside. Because you're tracking the imbalance, whether you admit it to yourself or not. And eventually it surfaces, often in a form disproportionate to whatever specific incident triggers it, because it's actually years of unacknowledged imbalance finally demanding attention. The Stoic response isn't to become coldly transactional in the pejorative sense, keeping literal scorecards, withholding warmth until repaid, treating every relationship as a negotiation. That would be its own kind of dysfunction, and it misses something the Stoics valued deeply. They believed humans are naturally social creatures, part of a broader community bound together by shared reason. And Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminds himself that he is made for cooperation, not isolated self-interest, comparing uncooperative behavior to a body part refusing to work with the rest of the body. Generosity, in the Stoic view, is not a naive mistake. It's part of what a good human life actually consists of. The synthesis the Stoics point toward is this: give generously, because generosity is good for your own character, regardless of what you receive back. This is the actual Stoic position, and it's more demanding than pure transactionalism, not less. But do not confuse your own generosity with an obligation on the other person's part to reciprocate identically, and do not stay silently resentful in a relationship whose exchange has become fundamentally unbalanced when you have the power to address it directly or to walk away. The brutal honesty here cuts both directions. Acknowledge that you are, in fact, tracking the exchange, even in your most sacred relationships, because pretending you're not just pushes the accounting underground where it does more damage. And simultaneously hold yourself to a standard of giving that isn't purely calculated, because a life spent only giving exactly what you expect to receive back is a smaller, more anxious life than the one available to you. Practically, this means periodically taking honest stock of your significant relationships. What am I giving here, And what am I receiving? Across the dimensions that actually matter to me. Emotional support, practical reliability, honesty, enjoyment, respect. Where the exchange has been chronically lopsided, address it directly rather than letting it calcify into silent resentment. A direct conversation about needs and imbalance is far more consistent with Stoic honesty than either silent martyrdom or silent withdrawal. And where a relationship has become so unbalanced that direct address doesn't change it, recognize that walking away from an unequal exchange, even a sanctified one, is not a betrayal of some higher standard of love. It's simply accurate accounting, applied honestly to a part of life most people prefer to leave unexamined. The brutal truth: the relationships you've been calling unconditional have conditions. Naming them honestly won't destroy those relationships. It will very likely improve the ones worth keeping, and clarify which ones were never actually operating the way you told yourself they were. Law 13. You are manipulated more often than you realize. Epictetus taught his students to examine every impression before granting it assent, to ask, before believing or acting on any idea that arrives in the mind, whether it is actually true or merely appears true. He taught this as a defense, and it's worth understanding what he was defending against. The simple fact that human beings are remarkably susceptible to having their beliefs, desires, and decisions shaped by other people, skilled at exploiting the mind's shortcuts, and most people go through life assuming they're far less susceptible to this than they actually are. Modern psychology has mapped these shortcuts extensively. Robert Cialdini's research on influence identified core principles that manipulators, whether con artists, cult recruiters, or simply skilled salespeople, use with remarkable consistency. Reciprocity: small gifts create outsized feelings of obligation. Social proof: people default to copying what others are doing, especially under uncertainty. The same mimetic mechanism from Law 6. Authority: people defer to perceived expertise or status far more readily than they'd admit. Scarcity: artificial urgency short-circuits careful evaluation. And commitment: consistency: people will go to great lengths to act consistently with a small prior commitment, even one extracted through manipulation. None of these require you to be unintelligent. They exploit universal features of how human cognition works under time pressure or social pressure, which means intelligence alone offers you very little protection. Darker manipulation tactics build on the same foundation. Gaslighting, a term drawn from a 1938 play and film in which a husband manipulates his wife into doubting her own perception of reality, describes a pattern where a person systematically denies or distorts another person's accurate perceptions until the target starts to distrust their own judgment more than they distrust the manipulator's account. Love bombing, a tactic documented extensively in research on coercive relationships and high control groups, front-loads a relationship with intense affection and attention specifically to create a powerful, disorienting sense of obligation and attachment before the manipulator's real demands or controlling behavior begins to surface. The brutal truth is that recognizing these tactics in the abstract does not make you immune to them in practice, because they're designed to bypass the slow, deliberate part of cognition and land directly on the fast automatic part. Precisely, the first jolt. The Stoics identified in Law 8's discussion of anger. Epictetus's actual defense wasn't be smarter. It was build the habit of pausing before assent, treating every strong impulse to believe, agree, or comply as a hypothesis to be examined rather than a fact to be accepted. especially when the impulse arrives with unusual urgency or emotional intensity, since urgency and intensity are themselves the primary tools manipulators use to prevent examination, practically. When you notice a decision suddenly feels urgent, when a stranger's warmth feels disproportionate to how long you've known them, when a group's consensus is being used as evidence that you personally should agree, or when someone's account of events requires you to distrust your own clear memory of what happened, slow down deliberately before granting assent. That pause, uncomfortable and unnatural as it feels in the moment, is precisely the discipline Epictetus spent his teaching career trying to install in his students, because he understood that the untrained mind says yes far faster than it should. Law 14. Kindness without boundaries is self-destruction. Seneca wrote that a wise person gives generously, but never so generously that they leave themselves in need. And this line, easy to skim past, contains a rebuke of a very specific modern failure mode, the belief that being a genuinely good person means having no limits on what you'll give, tolerate, or sacrifice for others. The Stoics valued generosity as a genuine virtue, not a performance. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about humanity's social nature and the obligation to act for the common good. But nowhere in the Stoic corpus is generosity treated as unlimited or indiscriminate. Seneca specifically warned against giving to people who would misuse the gift, or giving in a way that depleted the giver's own capacity to function and to help again in the future. Not because the recipients didn't matter, but because a giver who destroys their own resources, physical or emotional, in the act of giving ultimately has less, not more, to offer over time, and often ends up requiring rescue themselves. This maps onto a well-documented psychological pattern. Chronic self-sacrifice without boundaries doesn't reliably produce gratitude or improved outcomes for the people receiving it. It frequently produces what researchers studying caregiver burnout and codependency describe as resentment, exhaustion, and a corrosion of the relationship itself, because unlimited giving often removes the recipient's own incentive or opportunity to develop capacity, while draining the giver toward a breaking point that helps no one. This is documented extensively in family systems research on enabling behavior within relationships involving addiction, where a parent or partner's unlimited, boundary-free help, covering debts, making excuses, absorbing consequences, frequently prolongs and worsens the very problem it's intended to solve, precisely because it removes the natural consequences that would otherwise motivate change. Boundaries, in the Stoic framework, aren't selfishness. They're an application of the dichotomy of control from Law 1. You control what you give, how much, and under what conditions. You do not control how it's received, used, or reciprocated. And pretending otherwise, giving without limit and expecting that unlimited giving to produce a specific grateful, improved response in someone else, sets you up for exactly the kind of disappointment covered in Law 11. A boundary is simply an honest, upfront statement of what you're actually willing and able to give, which protects both your own capacity and the relationship's long-term health, rather than letting resentment silently accumulate until it erupts or the relationship collapses under its own imbalance. Law 15. People respect indifference more than neediness. This is an uncomfortable social truth, but it's consistently observable, and the Stoics understood the mechanism behind it, centuries before social psychology gave it formal names. Epictetus taught that a person who does not desperately need anything from others, approval, attention, reassurance, occupies a fundamentally different social position than a person who does, and other people can sense the difference almost immediately, often without being able to articulate exactly how they know. This isn't mystical. It's a direct consequence of the dichotomy of control. A person who has built their sense of worth on their own judgment, Law 1, Law 7, doesn't need the room's approval to function, and that self-sufficiency reads, socially, as a kind of quiet authority. While a person visibly hungry for approval signals, often unconsciously through tone, pacing, and body language, that their own sense of worth is currently up for negotiation, which paradoxically makes other people trust and respect them less, not more. Social psychology has documented versions of this under the study of perceived status and approach versus avoidance social signaling. Research on interpersonal attraction and leadership perception consistently finds that visible neediness, excessive flattery, over-explaining, seeking constant reassurance, correlates with lower perceived status and lower attraction, while a baseline of calm self-sufficiency correlates with higher perceived status, even when the underlying competence between the needy and self-sufficient person is identical. People are, in effect, reading confidence as a costly signal, something hard to fake convincingly unless you actually don't need what you appear not to need. The brutal implication: much of the neediness that damages your relationships and your social standing is invisible to you, but obvious to everyone around you, because it leaks out through channels, tone, timing, over-eagerness, that are much harder to consciously control than your words are. The Stoic solution isn't to fake indifference, while secretly still needing approval desperately. People are, on some level, quite good at detecting a performed version of confidence, since it lacks the settled quality of the real thing. The actual solution is the harder, slower work from Law 7. Build genuine internal sufficiency, so the outward calm isn't a mask over neediness, but an accurate report of an inner state that no longer requires external approval to feel stable. Law 16. Your enemies teach you more than your friends. Marcus Aurelius kept, throughout his reign, difficult relationships with rivals, critics, and at least one open rebellion led by a general he had trusted, Avidius Cassius. His response, recorded in the Meditations, is startling. Rather than treating his opponents purely as threats to be destroyed, he treated them repeatedly as instructive sources of information about his own blind spots, his own weaknesses, and the limits of his own self-control, in a way his flatterers and supporters never could be, because flatterers have no incentive to show him anything but a comfortable reflection of what he already believed about himself. This is a specific, deliberately uncomfortable Stoic practice. Friends, by the nature of the relationship, tend to soften their feedback, avoid your rawest weaknesses, and reflect back a version of you that preserves the relationship's warmth. Enemies and critics have no such incentive. They will find and expose exactly the weakness you'd most like to keep hidden, with none of the diplomatic softening a friend would apply. That's precisely what makes the feedback valuable, however unpleasant it is to receive. Seneca similarly argued that a person who only surrounds themselves with agreement learns nothing, while a person willing to sit with criticism, even hostile criticism, gains accurate information about themselves unavailable anywhere else. This doesn't mean seeking out enemies, or treating cruelty as a gift to be grateful for regardless of intent. It means, when criticism or hostility arrives, separating the two questions that get instinctively fused together. Is this person's intent good or bad? And is the content of what they're saying accurate or inaccurate. A hostile critic can still be right about a real weakness, and dismissing accurate information purely because of the messenger's bad intent means discarding data you can't get anywhere else. The Stoic move is to extract the accurate portion, discard the malice, and treat the resulting information the same way you'd treat feedback from anyone else, as data to be examined, not as an attack to be either absorbed wholesale or defensively rejected wholesale. Law 17. Most people are sleepwalking through life, and so were you. Marcus Aurelius describes most people around him as living without genuinely examining their own principles, drifting through habitual reactions and borrowed opinions rather than deliberately chosen ones, not out of malice, but out of simple inattention, the same inattention that governed his own life before he committed to philosophical practice. This is a harder truth to sit with than it first appears, because it applies retroactively. If most people are sleepwalking, you were almost certainly sleepwalking too, for large stretches of your life, possibly including right now in areas you haven't yet examined. Sleepwalking here means operating on autopilot, reacting to situations with the first emotional response that arrives, Law 2, rather than examining it, pursuing desires absorbed from other people, Law 6, rather than genuinely chosen ones, maintaining a self-image built more from performance than character, Law 4, and rarely, if ever, stopping to ask whether the trajectory of an ordinary day, or week, or year actually reflects considered values, or simply reflects momentum and habit. This isn't a character flaw unique to lazy or unintelligent people. It's the default mode of human cognition, which relies heavily on automatic, low-effort processing, what psychologist Daniel Kahneman termed System 1 thinking, precisely because deliberate. Examined thinking is metabolically expensive and cannot realistically be sustained across every moment of every day, the brutal implication for how you deal with other people. Much of what looks like malice, indifference, or selfishness in the people around you is often better explained by simple, unexamined autopilot than by deliberate ill intent. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. Law 11 already established that accountability still applies, but it changes how you interpret it. The friend who forgot your birthday is more likely operating on overwhelmed autopilot than executing a considered judgment that you don't matter. The colleague who took credit for your work is more likely running an automatic self-preservation script than plotting your downfall. Understanding this doesn't require you to tolerate the behavior, but it does allow a more accurate, less personally devastating interpretation of it, which, per Law 2, changes how much it actually hurts you. Law 18. Forgiveness is for you, not them. Marcus Aurelius returns again and again to a specific formula for dealing with people who have wronged him. Understand that they acted out of ignorance about what is truly good. Pity their confusion rather than matching it with your own anger, and release the resentment. Not because they've necessarily earned release through apology or changed behavior, but because carrying the resentment does measurable damage to the one carrying it, while doing no damage at all to the person it's aimed at, who in many cases isn't even aware it exists. This is worth stating in its most uncomfortable form. Forgiveness, in the Stoic framework, is not primarily a gift you give the wrongdoer. It is a form of self-preservation. Resentment, held over time, functions as a kind of ongoing rehearsal of the original injury, reliving it repeatedly, each replay generating a fresh dose of the same negative emotional and physiological response the original event caused, while the person who caused it moves on entirely unaffected. This connects directly to Law 3's argument about scarce time. Every hour spent rehearsing a grievance is an hour of your own irreplaceable time spent, essentially, on the wrongdoer's behalf, without their knowledge or consent. Modern research on forgiveness backs this up with striking consistency. Studies on chronic resentment and unforgiveness find associations with elevated cortisol, increased cardiovascular strain, and worse, mental health outcomes for the person holding the grudge, largely independent of whether the original relationship was ever repaired. Forgiveness researchers, including psychologist Robert Enright, distinguish forgiveness carefully from reconciliation. You can forgive, meaning release the internal rehearsal of resentment, without reconciling, meaning without restoring trust or resuming the relationship. These are separate decisions, and conflating them is precisely why people resist forgiveness, believing incorrectly that releasing the resentment requires readmitting the wrongdoer into their life on the same terms as before. The brutal, freeing version of this truth: you do not owe the person who wronged you an apology-triggered permission to move on. You are allowed to release the resentment on your own timeline, for your own benefit, regardless of whether they ever acknowledge what they did. Because waiting for their acknowledgement before granting yourself release means handing them, indefinitely, control over when your own suffering ends. Law 19. You will be misunderstood, and that's not your problem to fix. Epictetus taught his students to distinguish sharply between their intentions, which are within their control, and other people's interpretations of their actions, which are not, and he warned specifically against the exhausting, ultimately futile project of trying to manage how everyone perceives you, because perception depends on factors entirely outside your authority. The observer's own history, biases, mood, and prior assumptions, none of which you can access or correct from the outside. This is a brutal truth because it cuts against a deeply ingrained instinct. When misunderstood, most people's first response is to over-explain, to keep clarifying, to keep trying additional angles of explanation until the other person finally gets it. Sometimes this works. Often, particularly when the misunderstanding is rooted in the other person's own assumptions or motivated reasoning, rather than a genuine lack of information, no amount of additional explanation closes the gap because the problem was never a deficit of information in the first place. The Stoic position, consistent with the dichotomy of control from Law 1, is this: you are responsible for communicating honestly and clearly, to the best of your ability, and once you've done that, the resulting interpretation belongs to the listener, not to you. This doesn't mean giving up on communication or refusing to clarify when clarification would genuinely help. It means recognizing the point at which continued effort is being spent chasing an outcome, another person's correct understanding of you, that isn't fully within your control, and redirecting that effort toward your own conduct instead, which is, practically, this means noticing the specific anxiety of being misunderstood, naming it as a form of the validation chasing covered in Law 7, and asking, have I communicated honestly and clearly? If yes, the remaining discomfort belongs to the category of things not up to you, and holding on to it produces exactly the kind of wasted suffering covered in Law 5. Worrying over an outcome that additional worry cannot actually control. Law 20. Loyalty is rare. Build your life assuming it is. Seneca advised his friend Lucilius to test people carefully before extending deep trust, and to accept, once tested, that only a small number of people in any life will prove reliably loyal across real pressure. Advice that sounds cynical until you notice it's paired with an instruction to value the few who pass that test enormously. Precisely because their rarity is what makes them valuable, this connects to Law 9's brutal truth about untested principles. Loyalty, like any other stated value, is cheap until it's actually tested by real cost, inconvenience, social risk, competing self-interest. Most people's stated loyalty has simply never been billed for its price, and you often cannot know in advance which of your relationships would survive a genuine test until circumstances force the test to happen. This isn't a reason for blanket suspicion of everyone in your life. It's a reason to build your expectations and your practical planning around the statistical reality that loyalty under real pressure is rare, rather than around the more comforting but less reliable assumption that most people close to you would pass a serious test if one arrived. What does building your life around this assumption actually look like? It means not structuring your financial, emotional, or practical security entirely around any single relationship's guaranteed permanence, since even good relationships can fail unexpectedly under pressure. It means noticing, without cynicism, which relationships have actually been tested by real cost and past, and treating those specifically. Not the larger circle of untested, pleasant relationships as the ones worth the deepest investment. And it means extending real gratitude to the rare people who have proven, through tested loyalty, that they belong in that smaller circle, rather than taking their reliability for granted simply because it's been consistent. This closes the truths about other people. You've now examined how consistently people disappoint, how relationships actually run on exchange, how manipulable the mind is, why boundaries matter more than boundless giving, and how rare real loyalty turns out to be under pressure. The next part turns towards something harder still, not other people's failures, but the structure of suffering and power itself, starting with an uncomfortable claim. The comfort you've been chasing all along is quietly making you weaker. Part 3. The truths about suffering and power. Law 21. Comfort makes you weak. Seneca, writing from considerable personal wealth, delivered one of the sharpest warnings in the entire Stoic corpus against exactly the kind of comfort his own position afforded him. He argued that constant ease erodes a person's capacity to withstand hardship, the same way muscles atrophy without resistance, and he deliberately practiced voluntary hardship, periods of simple food, plain clothing, and deliberately spare living, specifically to keep his tolerance for discomfort from decaying, so that if real poverty or real deprivation ever arrived, it would arrive as familiar territory rather than as unbearable catastrophe. This practice, premeditatio malorum's physical cousin, is not ancient masochism. It has a clear, testable logic behind it. A nervous system that never encounters discomfort loses its calibration for what discomfort actually feels like and how survivable it actually is, meaning ordinary. Minor hardships start to register as much larger threats than they actually are. This maps onto a documented psychological phenomenon called hedonic adaptation. People who experience increasingly comfortable, frictionless circumstances don't end up more satisfied over time. They simply recalibrate their baseline upward, so that yesterday's luxury becomes today's minimum expectation, and any dip below that expectation, even a dip that would have felt neutral or good by an earlier baseline, now registers as genuine deprivation. The brutal implication. Chasing ever-increasing comfort doesn't make you more resilient to life's inevitable hardships. It makes you progressively less able to tolerate anything below your current, ever-rising baseline, which means comfort-seeking, taken to its logical endpoint, produces a person who is more fragile, not less, exactly the opposite of comfort's promised effect. This shows up starkly in research on safetyism and anxiety among populations raised with historically unprecedented physical and material security. Some psychologists studying rising anxiety rates among young people in wealthy nations have pointed to the systematic removal of manageable childhood risk and discomfort. Unsupervised play, physical setbacks, unstructured failure, as a plausible contributor to lower resilience and higher reported anxiety, even as objective material safety has increased. The Stoic countermeasure isn't asceticism for its own sake. It's deliberate, periodic voluntary discomfort, cold, hunger, physical exertion, simplicity undertaken specifically to keep your tolerance calibrated, so that when involuntary hardship arrives, as it eventually does for everyone, it meets a person who has practiced discomfort recently enough to know, from direct experience, that it is survivable. Law 22. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is a choice you keep making. The distinction this law turns on is subtle but load-bearing. Pain is the raw, physical or situational fact. The injury, the loss, the setback. Suffering, in the Stoic and later Buddhist framing that arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion, independently, is the additional layer of resistance, story, and resentment we build on top of the raw pain, and that additional layer, unlike the pain itself, is substantially optional. Epictetus, whose own leg was reportedly broken by his master, is reported to have observed calmly, in the moment, that the leg would break, and it did, demonstrating in the most literal way available to him the difference between the pain itself, real, physical, unavoidable, and the panic, rage, or despair that typically accompanies pain. A separate, additional layer, generated by judgment rather than by the injury itself. This isn't a claim that pain doesn't hurt, or that a broken leg feels the same as an intact one. It's a claim that the total experience of a painful event is composed of the raw sensation plus an interpretive layer. And that interpretive layer, this shouldn't be happening to me. This ruins bear this, is where most of the prolonged suffering actually lives. And it's exactly the layer within your control to examine, per Law 2's model of emotion as opinion. This has a documented parallel in contemporary pain psychology. Research on chronic pain consistently finds that psychological factors, catastrophizing thoughts, resistance, fear of the pain, significantly predict how disabling and distressing pain becomes, independent of the raw physical severity of the underlying condition. Acceptance-based interventions for chronic pain, which explicitly teach patients to stop fighting the sensation and instead make room for it, while continuing to engage in valued activity, have shown meaningful improvements in functioning and quality of life, even when the underlying physical pain level doesn't change at all. Direct clinical evidence for the ancient claim that the resistance layer, not only the raw sensation, drives much of the disability. The practical move is not Stoic numbness toward pain, but the same examination before assent practiced throughout this book. When pain arrives, notice the raw sensation and separately notice the story being layered on top of it. This is unbearable. This proves my life is falling apart. And treat that second layer as an opinion to be examined, not a fact to be accepted, because it is very often adding suffering the original pain never required. Law 23. Power reveals character. It doesn't corrupt it, it exposes it. The common saying holds that power corrupts, but the Stoic view, borne out by considerable modern research, is subtly and importantly different. Power doesn't install new character traits in a person from scratch. It removes the constraints, social consequence, oversight, need for approval, that had been suppressing traits that were already there, and lets them surface without disguise. Marcus Aurelius, holding more unchecked power than almost anyone in his era, understood this danger directly and structured much of his private philosophical practice specifically to counteract it, reminding himself constantly of his own fallibility, his shared humanity with those he ruled, and the emptiness of the flattery that power inevitably attracts, precisely because he recognized that his position had removed most of the external checks that would normally keep unexamined character flaws in check. He wasn't worried that power would install cruelty in him from nothing. He was worried that power would remove the social cost that had, until then, been suppressing cruelty or vanity that may already have existed in some form. Research on power and behavior supports this revealing model over the corrupting one. Studies in social psychology, examining how experimentally granted power affects behavior, find that power tends to amplify pre-existing dispositions rather than uniformly creating new ones. People already inclined toward generosity often become more generous with increased power and resources, while people already inclined toward self-interest or disregard for others often become more exploitative, with the power acting as an amplifier and a remover of restraint rather than as a uniform corrupting force. Power also reliably reduces a person's attentiveness to others' perspectives, a well-documented effect, sometimes described as reduced perspective-taking. Among people placed in high-power roles, even briefly in controlled experiments, which helps explain why people who seemed humble and considerate before gaining power can become strikingly less so afterward, not because power installed arrogance, but because power removed the situational pressure that had previously required them to consider other people's viewpoints in order to get what they wanted. The brutal implication. The true test of a person's character isn't how they behave when they need something from you or when they are being watched. It's how they behave when they have power over you, and no one is checking. This is worth applying both outward, in evaluating people who gain power over you, and inward, in honestly examining your own behavior in whatever pockets of unchecked power you hold, however small, because those are exactly the places your own unexamined character, for better or worse, is most likely to surface without disguise. Law 24. You will face injustice, and fairness was never guaranteed. One of the hardest Stoic positions to fully accept is this. The universe does not owe you fairness, has never promised it, and organizing your emotional stability around an expectation of fairness guarantees repeated, unnecessary devastation every time reality fails to deliver on a promise it never actually made. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminds himself that events unfold according to nature's larger order, not according to individual human notions of desert or fairness, and that expecting a bad person to prosper less than a good one, or a good person to be spared hardship because they've earned exemption through virtue, is simply a category error about how the world works. This is not an argument that justice doesn't matter, or that we shouldn't work to correct injustice where we can. Stoic ethics places enormous weight on acting justly yourself, and on correcting wrongdoing within your power to correct. It's a narrower, more specific claim. The expectation that the universe will automatically balance the books, rewarding virtue and punishing vice in your own lifetime, on a timeline you'll get to witness, is an expectation the evidence simply doesn't support, and holding it produces devastating disappointment precisely because it's not actually a claim about how reality functions. This connects to research on what psychologists call the just world hypothesis, a well-documented cognitive bias first named by psychologist Melvin Lerner, in which people instinctively assume the world is fundamentally fair. Good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, or to people who somehow deserved it. This bias is comforting, but it produces a well-documented and troubling side effect. When people witness someone suffering an unjust hardship, particularly one that can't easily be explained by anything the victim did wrong, the just world bias often pushes observers to unconsciously blame the victim anyway, simply to preserve the comforting belief that the world is fair. A dynamic visible in everything from reactions to crime victims, to reactions toward people experiencing poverty or illness. The brutal, freeing move is to drop the expectation of cosmic fairness entirely, while keeping intact your own commitment to acting justly and correcting injustice where you have real power to do so. This isn't cynicism, it's accuracy, and it removes the specific, repeated wound of being shocked, again and again, by an unfairness the universe never promised to prevent. Law 25: Victimhood feels safe but keeps you small. This is one of the harder truths in this book to state carefully, because it sits close to genuine harm, and the Stoics were not dismissive of real suffering caused by real injustice. Epictetus himself had been enslaved, and his philosophy does not pretend that oppression or genuine mistreatment isn't real. The distinction this law draws is narrower and more specific, between accurately naming harm that was done to you, which is honest and often necessary, and building an ongoing identity around that harm in a way that forecloses your own agency going forward. Epictetus's core teaching, delivered from a position of having experienced genuine, severe injustice, was that even under conditions of real oppression, the one domain that remained entirely his judgment, his responses, his choices about his own character, could not be taken from him by his enslaver. And he built his entire philosophy around cultivating and protecting that one remaining domain, rather than organizing his identity around the injustice itself. This is a radical claim precisely because it comes from someone with unimpeachable standing to make it. He wasn't a comfortable observer lecturing others about resilience from safety. He was describing what he had actually needed to do to retain psychological freedom under literal enslavement. Modern psychology has documented a related, narrower phenomenon worth distinguishing carefully from simply acknowledging real harm. Research on what's sometimes called victim identity or rumination-focused coping finds that people who center an identity heavily around past victimization, as opposed to acknowledging the harm while maintaining a broader sense of agency and possibility, tend to show worse long-term psychological outcomes. Not because their original harm wasn't real, but because an identity organized primarily around what was done to you tends to narrow, over time, the range of action and possibility a person can imagine for themselves going forward. This is a delicate, easily misused finding. It should never be weaponized to dismiss or minimize someone's real, ongoing pain, or to rush anyone through a grieving or recovery process on someone else's timeline. The Stoic position, held carefully, is this: name the harm accurately. Hold whoever caused it accountable where accountability is possible, and then, on your own timeline, not anyone else's, resist letting the harm become the entire architecture of your identity. because the part of you, Epictetus insisted, could never be taken by an oppressor, is still there, still available, and still yours to build from, regardless of what was done to you. Law 26. Discipline is the only real freedom you'll ever have. It sounds like a contradiction. Discipline as freedom, restraint as liberty, until you examine what the alternative to discipline actually looks like in practice. Not freedom, but a life driven by whichever impulse, craving, or borrowed desire, Law 6, happens to be loudest in a given moment, which is not self-direction at all, but a kind of servitude to your own least examined reactions. Epictetus made this argument directly. A person ruled by their appetites and impulses, however much that person insists on their own freedom, is not actually free. They are simply obeying a master who happens to live inside their own head rather than outside it. And that internal master, made of unexamined cravings and reactive habits, is often far harsher and more relentless than an external one would be, because it never sleeps and never negotiates. Genuine freedom in this framework isn't the absence of restraint. It's the capacity to act according to your own considered judgment, rather than according to whatever impulse currently has the loudest voice. And that capacity has to be built through repeated, deliberate practice, the same way any other skill is built. This connects to a large body of modern research on self-regulation and delayed gratification, most famously, the marshmallow test studies begun by psychologist Walter Mischel in the 1960s, which found that children's ability to delay gratification in a controlled experiment correlated with a range of better outcomes. Years later, including academic achievement and social functioning, though later, more careful replications complicated the original findings, showing that the effect is substantially explained by socioeconomic stability and trust in the experimenter's reliability, which is itself an important addition to the Stoic point. Discipline is not purely a matter of raw willpower, and building it is easier in conditions of security and harder under conditions of genuine scarcity or instability. That complication doesn't erase the core finding, though it refines it. The capacity to act according to considered judgment rather than immediate impulse remains strongly linked to better long-term outcomes across the research that followed, even as our understanding of what builds that capacity has become more nuanced. The brutal, practical implication: every time you act on an impulse without examination, the purchase, the outburst, the procrastination, the scroll, you are not exercising freedom. You are being governed by whatever produced the impulse, and calling it freedom is simply a comfortable misnomer. Real freedom requires the harder, less immediately gratifying discipline of pausing, examining, and choosing. The same practice this entire book has been building toward, law after law, and it compounds. Each instance of examined choice makes the next one slightly easier. The same way each instance of unexamined impulse makes the next impulse slightly harder to resist. Law 27. Nobody is coming to save you. This is the hardest truth in this part, and possibly in the entire book, because it strips away a hope most people carry quietly and rarely examine directly. The hope that eventually, if things get bad enough, someone, a partner, a parent, an institution, a stroke of luck, will step in and rescue them from the consequences of their own circumstances or choices. The Stoics were unambiguous on this point, and it's connected directly back to Law 1's dichotomy of control. Epictetus taught that relying on external rescue for problems that are actually within your own domain of judgment and action is a fundamental confusion about where your agency actually lives. Waiting for rescue is, in effect, outsourcing your own responsibility to something outside your control, and that outsourcing guarantees prolonged suffering, because the rescue, being outside your control, may never arrive, or may arrive too late, or may arrive in a form that doesn't actually address what's wrong. This isn't a claim that help doesn't matter, or that you shouldn't accept support when it's genuinely offered. The Stoics valued community and mutual aid, as covered in Law 12. The distinction is between accepting real help that's actually offered and organizing your plans and your psychological stability around a hoped-for rescue that hasn't materialized and may not. Marcus Aurelius, commanding an empire through plague and war, could not wait for rescue. There was no higher authority positioned to save him from the crises he faced, and his entire philosophical practice was built around the recognition that the response had to come from him, using the resources actually available, rather than from some hoped-for external intervention. Psychological research on learned helplessness. Originally documented by Martin Seligman in the 1960s, offers a stark warning about the cost of waiting passively for external rescue. Organisms, including humans, that experience repeated situations where their own actions don't produce results, can generalize that lesson into passivity, even in new situations where action would actually work. They stop trying because trying has previously failed to produce rescue. Later research, including Seligman's own later work on learned optimism, found this pattern is reversible, but only through deliberately rebuilding the belief that one's own actions can produce change, which requires actually acting and observing the results, rather than continuing to wait for external rescue to arrive. The brutal and ultimately clarifying truth: the resources you need to address most of what's actually within your control already belong to you in the form of your own judgment, effort, and choices, however limited those may feel in a hard moment. Waiting for rescue delays the deployment of the resources you actually have. This closes the truths about suffering and power. The final part turns to the questions the Stoics considered the most important of all, the ones about meaning and mortality that everything else in this book has quietly been building toward. Part 4. The Truths About Meaning and Death. Law 28. Your legacy will be forgotten faster than you think. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, wrote to himself, with startling directness, that even the most celebrated names of history are eventually forgotten, that the vast majority of people who will ever be praised for their achievements are unknown to the very people praising the current generation's achievements, and that chasing a lasting reputation across future generations who will never know you personally is a specific, common form of the borrowed desire covered in Law 6. Wanting something not because it will genuinely benefit you, but because the idea of being remembered feels good to imagine now, even though you will not be present to experience whatever remembering does or doesn't happen. This is verifiably true at a scale that should be sobering. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of individual human beings who have ever lived, including people who were, in their own time, locally famous, respected, or influential, left no lasting record accessible to anyone alive today. Even among historical figures whose names survive, the actual texture of their daily existence, their private worries, their specific personality is almost entirely lost, reduced to a handful of facts and interpretations layered on by people who never knew them. Marcus Aurelius himself is a partial exception, only because a private notebook he almost certainly never intended for publication happened to survive nearly 2 millennia by accident, a fact he could not have planned for or predicted, which rather proves his own point about how little control anyone has over what, if anything, outlasts them, the brutal implication. If you're currently organizing significant life choices around how you'll be remembered, you're optimizing for an outcome that is both statistically unlikely to materialize in any meaningful form and, even in the rare cases where it does, entirely outside your ability to control or experience. The Stoic redirect isn't nihilism. Nothing matters, so do whatever. It's a redirect toward the thing that actually is within your control and that you will actually experience. The quality of your conduct and character during the finite years you are actually alive, which matters regardless of whether anyone remembers it afterward, because its value was never really located in the remembering to begin with. Law 29, meaning is not found, it's manufactured through action. A significant amount of modern unhappiness traces back to a specific, quiet assumption. That meaning is a thing to be discovered, somewhere out there. If you search long enough, try enough careers, read enough books, or have the right realization, and that until you find it, your life remains provisionally, uncomfortably incomplete. The Stoics rejected this search and discovery model almost entirely, replacing it with something more demanding, but also more immediately actionable. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly frames meaning not as something to be found, but as something generated directly through the quality of present action. Doing the current task, whatever it is, with full attention and in accordance with reason and virtue, is treated as sufficient in itself, not as a placeholder, while waiting for some larger, more meaningful purpose to reveal itself. This connects to a specific practical claim. Meaning isn't hiding in a career, a relationship status, or an achievement waiting to be unlocked. It's generated, moment by moment, through how you engage with whatever is actually in front of you. This reframing has substantial support in modern psychology on meaning and well-being. Viktor Frankl, drawing on his own experience surviving Nazi concentration camps and later developing logotherapy, argued explicitly against the idea that meaning is a fixed thing to be discovered once and possessed permanently. He described meaning instead as something continuously created through responsible action, through the stance one takes toward unavoidable suffering, and through engagement with specific tasks, relationships, and values, moment to moment, rather than through a single grand discovery that resolves the question permanently. Subsequent research on meaning in life consistently finds that people report higher levels of meaning, not primarily from major life events or achievements, but from ongoing engagement, purposeful daily activity, connection with others, and a sense of coherence between values and action, supporting the Fanyuk-Makshachad through action model over the waiting to be found model. The brutal, freeing implication. If you've been waiting for meaning to arrive before fully committing to your life, the waiting itself is the obstacle. Meaning doesn't precede committed action. It's generated by it, which means the tool for building a meaningful life was never something to search for externally. It was available the entire time, in the form of how you choose to engage with what's already in front of you. Law 30. You will die exactly as unfinished as everyone else. Act accordingly. We close where Stoic practice always eventually returns. Death, examined one final time, now with everything else in this book in view. Marcus Aurelius, near the end of the Meditations, reminds himself that no one dies having completed everything they intended. Every human life, however long, ends mid-sentence, with projects unfinished, relationships not fully resolved, ambitions not fully realized. He treats this not as a special tragedy reserved for the unlucky, but as the ordinary universal condition of every human death across all of history, his own included, and he draws from this a specific, practical conclusion. Since completeness was never actually available as an option, waiting for a sense of finished enough before living fully, before saying what needs saying, before acting on what actually matters, is waiting for a condition that was never going to arrive, regardless of how much more time you were granted. This is worth sitting with in its full weight, because it undercuts a specific, common form of procrastination, the belief that once certain loose ends are tied up, once the career stabilizes, once the kids are grown, once the health issue resolves, once conditions are finally right, then the meaningful life, the honest conversation, the resolved relationship, the pursued ambition can finally begin. Seneca, in On the Shortness of Life, identifies this exact pattern as one of the most common and costly forms of self-deception. People constantly postponing genuine living until some future condition is met, not noticing that the postponed life is the only life actually available to them, being spent irreversibly in the waiting itself. Every truth in this book has pointed toward the same underlying instruction, arrived at from different angles. You don't control outcomes, only your own conduct. Law 1. Your emotions and desires are more manufactured and more examinable than they feel. Laws 2:6. Other people will disappoint you in predictable, survivable ways, and your response to that is more within your control than their behavior is. Part 2. Comfort, unexamined, makes you fragile, and unearned rescue isn't coming. Part 3. And now, finally, completeness was never on offer to begin with, which means the only honest move is to stop waiting for conditions that don't arrive and start acting today, according to the values this entire book has asked you to examine. That's the brutal gift underneath all 30 of these truths, and it's worth stating plainly one last time. You will die unfinished, exactly like everyone who came before you, including every Stoic philosopher quoted in this book. Marcus Aurelius died unfinished. Seneca died unfinished, under orders, mid-sentence in every sense. Epictetus died unfinished. None of that diminished the value of how they lived in the time they actually had. Neither will it diminish yours. Conclusion: the brutal gift of clarity. We started this book with a promise. No comfort, just clarity. I want to close by being honest about what that clarity actually gets you, because it isn't nothing, even though it isn't the soft reassurance most books in this space are built to offer. You now know that you control almost nothing except your own judgment and conduct, and that this, properly understood, is enough. You know your emotions are opinions rather than facts, which means you have more say over your inner life than it usually feels like in the moment. You know that death is closer and more certain than you like to think about, and that this fact, used deliberately rather than avoided, sharpens rather than ruins the time you actually have. You know your self-image has been partly performance, your desires partly borrowed, your inner critic largely fear in disguise, and that all three of these are things you can gradually examine and rebuild on more honest ground. You know other people will disappoint you, that relationships run on exchange even when we call them unconditional, that manipulation is more common and harder to detect than you'd like to believe, and that boundaries are not a betrayal of kindness, but a condition for sustaining it. You know your anger is usually fear wearing a louder costume, that your principles are untested until pressure tests them, and that forgiveness is something you do for your own sake, on your own schedule. You know comfort, chased without limit, makes you more fragile rather than less. You know pain is inevitable, but suffering carries an optional layer you have more control over than it feels like. You know power reveals character rather than creating it, that fairness was never guaranteed, that victimhood, however real the original harm, can quietly become a smaller cage than the one that was first imposed on you, that discipline is the actual shape freedom takes, and that no one is coming to rescue you from the work only you can do. And you know, finally, that legacy fades faster than anyone expects. That meaning is built through action, rather than discovered by searching, and that you, like every philosopher quoted in this book, will die with the work unfinished, which was never a special punishment reserved for you. It's simply what a human life is. None of this is comfortable. All of it, I'd argue, is more useful than comfort would have been. The Stoics didn't build this philosophy to make people feel good. They built it to make people hard to break, not hard in the sense of cold or unfeeling, but hard in the sense of a structure that has been tested and reinforced, rather than one that's simply never been stress-tested at all. Comfort is a fair-weather structure. Clarity, even brutal clarity, holds up in the storm, because it was built with the storm already in mind. I said at the start that I wanted to talk to you the way a friend would, not the way a product tries to sell you something. So here's the friend's version of a closing thought, without the packaging. You are going to face hardship you can't currently predict, using resources you already partly possess and partly still need to build. This book was an attempt to hand you some of those resources, honestly, without pretending the road ahead is softer than it is. What you do with them from here is, entirely and non-negotiably, up to you, which, if you've actually absorbed Law 1, is exactly as it should be, live examined, not comforted. That was always the actual promise of this philosophy, and it's the only one I've tried to keep. If you've made it this far, you've already done something most people never will. You've stayed long enough to question your assumptions, confront uncomfortable truths, and look honestly at the parts of yourself that are often easier to ignore. I hope these ideas don't simply stay with you for today. I hope they become something you return to whenever life tests your patience, your courage, or your perspective. If you found this audiobook valuable, please take a moment to support the channel by leaving a like, subscribing if you haven't already, and sharing this video with someone who might need to hear these ideas. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Which of the 30 brutal truths about human nature challenged you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I read your comments, and they often inspire future books and audiobooks on this channel. And before you go, I'm excited to remind you that the Audiobook Vision Store is now open. If you'd like to own a beautifully formatted PDF edition of this book, build your personal library, or simply support the future of this channel, you'll find the store link in the description below. Thank you for spending your time with me. Until our next journey together, take care of your mind, protect your peace, and never stop searching for the truth.